There is the outer region of the ovaries known as ovarian cortex, and then the inner ovarian medulla. Of those two regions, we're really not going to talk about the medulla, but we will talk a lot about the cortex, which is where you find the developing eggs. Okay, so those ova that are being produced are going to be going through their stages of development through these, or through the ovarian cortex. Eggs develop in what we call ovarian follicles. They're just follicles, basically like bubbles. They're fluid filled, and inside of them is where the eggs are going through their development. Okay. As it states right there, under ovarian follicles consists of the oocytes, which are the levels of development of the eggs in their various stages of development. And then surrounding them are cells that form the kind of bubble-like structure. And so we're going to get to see that as we talk about oogenesis, which is infinitely more difficult and more complicated than spermatogenesis. And it does begin kind of the same way with germ cells, okay, which are the stem cells. This time, instead of calling them what we called them the other day, we're calling them oocytes. Okay, these are germ cells that migrate to the ovaries actually during fetal development. That's something that's very important to understand, is that females begin oogenesis before they're born. Okay. Men, we don't begin spermatogenesis until we hit puberty. Okay. Once inside the ovaries, those germ cells differentiate into what are called oogonia. These are diploid stem cells dividing mitotically to produce millions of germ cells. So diploid tells us how many chromosomes are in these cells. What's the diploid number in humans? Not 23, 46. Or you could say 23 pairs. Okay. Now, most of these germ cells actually degenerate prior to birth in a process called atresia. A few of them will develop into larger cells known as primary oocytes. And these are our first actual real egg-developing cells. They are the ones that will begin meiosis I. They begin prophase 1, but then they take a break, a very long break. Okay, it will not be completed until after puberty, so at least probably a decade or more. Okay. During this arrested stage of development, each primary oocyte is only surrounded by a single layer of flat follicular cells, and our bubble is known as a primordial follicle. On the next page, we can see that on our very top of the picture here of our ovary, the very smallest of our bubbles, a very single layer of cells surrounding that primary oocyte. Okay. At birth, approximately 200,000 to 2 million of them remain, but by the time a female reaches puberty, only about 40,000 are still present. And of those 40,000, only around 400 of them will mature and be ovulated during a woman's reproductive lifetime. Okay. And when she runs out, she runs out. She's never longer going to produce anymore. And that's the point when she reaches menopause. Each month after puberty, until she reaches menopause, hormones from the anterior pituitary will stimulate the development of several primordial follicles, although only one will reach maturity for ovulation. A few primordial follicles start to grow, developing into primary follicles, which consist of primary oocytes surrounded by a couple layers of granulosa cells. So here we can see our bubble is growing, and it will continue to grow, and it will grow now into a secondary follicle. Okay. And important about secondary follicles is that we first see a pretty good size cavity on the inside of our bubble. This is the purple shaded region called the antrum, where follicular fluid is going to develop. Okay. From the secondary follicle, the bubble will become a mature, or what we call Graafian follicle, which is very important because that, as you guys can see in our figure, is what will burst during ovulation. But before ovulation, we finally see the egg divide, finally completing meiosis I. Now this produces two haploid cells of unequal size. So now, Blair, we see the cells are 23 chromosomes in number. Okay. The two cells are a first polar body and a secondary oocyte. Okay. If I jump ahead to the next page, I'm going to kind of use these figures to kind of show you where we're at and how things are going. Okay, so here's our original stem cell. Okay, diploid, that thing goes through mitosis to form our primary oocytes. Before birth even begins, or before birth has happened, I should say, we have performed this process. And we begin meiosis 1 before birth. Okay, we call this the fetal period. Okay, nothing is going to change at this point from birth through childhood until puberty. Okay, and even at the beginning here, we still see our primary oocyte. What does change once the female reaches puberty is those primordial follicles can start developing through their stages, from a primordial to a primary to a secondary to a mature or Graafian, which is then able to be ovulated. Okay, so our primary oocyte, when it does divide, forms two cells. Look at the size differential between the two cells. The secondary oocyte is much larger than the first polar body. Okay, this first polar body is so small that it's basically just nothing, and it will just get discarded anyway. So we're not even going to care about it, even though, as you guys can see, it does divide. But we are going to focus in on the secondary oocyte, which you can see here is abbreviated in the inner part of the nucleus with the letter N, telling us that it has 23 chromosomes. Okay. That secondary oocyte is larger because it receives most of the cytoplasm and organelles, because the cell does not divide equally. And this is going to then begin, this cell will then begin meiosis 2. But then we stop again, this time in metaphase 2. Okay. And then we ovulate the egg, where it's released when that bubble bursts. Okay. And that egg is then going to be released into the fallopian tubes, the oviducts, uterine tubes, whatever you want to call them. Meiosis 2 will not resume if fertilization doesn't take place. Only will it resume if the egg becomes fertilized. If it doesn't, the ovum or egg will degenerate. If it does get fertilized, meiosis 2 will resume. Okay? And we see the kind of same thing happening. So here's our egg, or here's our sperm penetrating the secondary oocyte, forming two cells. Okay, our secondary oocyte becomes an ovum and a second polar body. Just like the first polar body, the second polar body, we're not going to care whatsoever about. It will just basically degenerate. Okay, and you can even see we've labeled those over there kind of the same way. Okay. At this point, though, you can still see we represent our picture with two letter N's, because we have not actually fused the nucleus of those cells quite yet. Why is that important? Because in the nucleus is where you find the chromosomes. So we have not actually technically become diploid and numbered yet. When those nuclei fuse, that is what forms a diploid zygote. Okay. What we saw is with the egg. But if we look back in the ovaries, when that secondary oocyte was ovulated, we still have our bubble that has been burst. It doesn't degenerate. It actually remains as what we call a corpus luteum. And we can see that right here. Okay, so here's our bursted bubble, like our balloon is popped, but here's our deflated balloon, which sounds like it would be nothing, but it's very important because it releases several hormones. And it's going to do so for quite a while, but eventually it will degenerate unless fertilization has occurred. And in that case, that corpus luteum will continue to release its hormones. Those hormones we're going to talk about here in just a second. So, that's oogenesis. As you guys can already tell, hopefully anyway, it's pretty complicated. Pretty amazing though. Okay, let's talk about the other organs of the female reproductive system. Not quite as many things as men have. At least we're not going to talk about some of them anyway. From the ovaries, the ovulated secondary oocyte will travel through the uterine tubes. Uterine tubes are the same thing as fallopian tubes and oviducts. And all they do is carry that egg, hopefully fertilize if the female is wanting to get pregnant, and then carry that zygote to the uterus. There's 3 parts to it. Not really concerned with knowing the 3 parts, but I do want you to know one thing, that the ampulla is typically the site of fertilization by sperm. Very, very important. Okay, so when a male ejaculates inside of a female, the sperm will swim up through the vagina, up through the uterus, and all the way up to the middle part of the fallopian tubes. Speaking of the uterus, this is a very important site because that's where that zygote will, and it's no longer called a zygote, but called a blastocyst, will implant and develop into the baby. So the other name for uterus is the womb, which is described as a thick muscular chamber which harbors the fetus, provides a source of nutrition for the fetus, but also helps to expel it during childbirth. And there's a lot of muscle in here. Very thickest layer is called the myometrium, where the smooth muscle is located, and that's what will contract, and those are where the contractions that a female experiences when she's going through labor. And there's another layer outside of it called the perimetrium. I'm not worried about it. Physiologically, it's not that really important. The endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus, and we are going to talk about it because one of its 2 layers is shed during menstruation. We're going to talk about menstruation in just a bit. The base of the uterus is known as the cervix. You hear a lot about cervixes being like dilated during pregnancy and during labor. This is the opening that the baby must pass through on its way through the birth canal. And the birth canal a lot of times is known as the vagina, a tube that allows for discharge of the menstrual fluid, receiving of the penis and semen, and then birth of the baby. And a lot of information in there I'm not really going to talk about. You can kind of read through it on your own. We've talked about the vagina before, and its role in like preventing bacterial growth and that kind of stuff because of the fluids that it produces. Okay, so we saw how complicated oogenesis was. My opinion is that the next couple slides where we talk about the reproductive cycle of the female is quite a bit even more complicated. It's probably the most complicated part of the lecture. So if I get lost or you guys get lost anyway, don't hesitate to tell me to slow down. All right. During their reproductive years, non-pregnant females normally exhibit cyclical changes in the ovaries and the uterus, usually taking about a month, about 28 days. And we have what we call the ovarian cycle, which is a series of events in the ovaries occurring during and after maturation of an oocyte. And then we have the uterine or the menstrual cycle, which refers to things going on in the uterus. Specifically, it's endometrium, the inner lining. And we can combine those 2 cycles to come up with just the overall female reproductive cycle. Okay, and it involves several events, hormonal changes that regulate them, and then we also see cyclical changes in the breast and cervix, which we're really not going to talk too much about that. As I mentioned, it lasts about 28 days. It includes 4 phases. Those 4 phases we're going to get into here in just a second. But first, let's talk about the hormones. Okay. Several hormones regulate the cycle. What's cool about this is some of these hormones are actually involved with men. As we saw on Wednesday, we talked about those first 3 that are listed here, but obviously they have a different role in females than they do in men. With the exception being gonadotropin-releasing hormone. GnRH does the same thing in men and women. It is released from the hypothalamus and triggers the release of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary. There's no difference in what it does in men and women. Okay. FSH and LH do very different things in women and men. Okay. In women, FSH, we'll talk about it first. This is going to initiate follicular growth and stimulates the ovarian follicles to secrete estrogen. Okay. Why do you think we call it follicle-stimulating hormone? Because it stimulates the follicles. Okay. That's to me, the easiest thing to remember about it. Okay. Luteinizing hormone is the other hormone released by the anterior pituitary. It stimulates further development of the ovarian follicles, stimulates those ovarian follicles to secrete estrogens, stimulates developing follicles to produce androgens, and something very, very important is that it triggers ovulation. And therefore, it also subsequently helps to form what's called the corpus luteum, which is that bursted bubble. Ovulation is where that egg is released. Remember that. Okay, so we'll see a figure here in just a second where ovulation occurs right after we see LH peaking. Okay. Another set of hormones, and we've talked about these before, are the estrogens. These are released actually by the follicles, and these are hormones that do something very similar to what testosterone did in men. Okay. Promotes development and maintenance of the female reproductive structures and secondary sex characteristics, things like growth of the breast and pubic hair, underarm hair, that kind of stuff starts to develop. Increases protein anabolism, including building strong bones, lowers blood cholesterol, and will inhibit, if it goes high in level, GnRH, LH, and FSH. And, this is the group of hormones that females really start to decline in the amount they produce when they hit menopause. Okay. And that's why females after menopause or postmenopausal females are at high risk for brittle bone disease. What is that disease called? Osteoporosis. Okay. So one thing I always want to stress, and this is more just application stuff, is for you ladies out there, it's important, not even just when you get to be in postmenopausal, but now that you build your strong bones by getting enough calcium, but also stressing your bones with good hard work, because bones are kind of use it or lose it. Progesterone, secreted by the corpus luteum, that bursted bubble, works along with estrogens to prepare and maintain the endometrium for implantation and the mammary glands for milk production. And when its levels go up, it inhibits secretion of GnRH and LH. And then relaxin, released by the luteum as well, relaxes the uterus by inhibiting contraction of the myometrium. And at the end of pregnancy, it's very important because it increases flexibility of the pubic symphysis, which means that the hips can separate a little bit, and it helps to dilate the cervix for the baby to start pushing through. Inhibin is exactly what it sounds like. It's released by those growing follicles, and the corpus luteum after ovulation will inhibit secretion of FSH and, to a lesser extent, LH. So those are the hormones. Now we get to talk about the phases. Okay. And there are 4 phases. Days 1 through 5 are called the menstrual phase. Okay. Now this is for the entire, and I really should change the title of this slide to, instead of menstrual cycle, it should be female reproductive cycle, because that menstrual cycle really refers more to just the uterus. This is including uterus and ovaries. Okay. So what I've done for these different phases is talked about what's happening in those 2 different regions. Really 3 if you count the 2 ovaries and the 1 uterus. Okay, in the ovaries, under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, several of those primordial follicles are developing into primary follicles and then into secondary follicles. Remember, that's what FSH does. It develops the follicles. This process, though, takes several months, meaning that a follicle beginning its development in one cycle will not mature for several cycles later. In the uterus, this is when the female is menstruating. Okay, she's discharging menstrual fluid because of declining levels of estrogen and progesterone that stimulates blood vessels that are found in the uterus to constrict, and the cells that are found in that layer, what we call the stratum functionalis, start to die, and then they just basically get wiped away. And so during this phase where you'll see, and there's a figure to demonstrate this, the endometrium loses one of its 2 layers. Okay. The second phase is called the pre-ovulatory phase because it comes before ovulation, is the next week or so, 6 to 13 days. In the ovaries, some of the secondary follicles begin to secrete estrogens and inhibin. By about day 6, a secondary follicle in one of the ovaries has outgrown all the others, has become the dominant follicle. Estrogens and inhibin will be secreted by that dominant follicle to decrease levels of FSH, which would prevent any other follicles from growing. Now, in some cases, more than one dominant follicle will occur or develop. We call this codominance. Okay? And that's what can cause fraternal or non-identical twins, where two eggs end up getting ovulated and then two eggs end up getting fertilized. And we'll talk about fraternal and identical twins here in just a little bit. Normally, though, one dominant follicle becomes mature Graafian follicle. In the ovarian cycle, both the menstrual and the pre-ovulatory phase are called the follicular phase because the follicles are growing. In the uterus, the estrogens that are released by those growing follicles stimulate the repair of the endometrium. The cells of the stratum bassalis are undergoing mitosis to form a new functionalis. That was the layer that was lost. During this 7 days or so, the endometrium doubles in thickness. Okay. For this reason, we call that part of the uterine cycle the proliferative phase. Okay. Day 14 of the day 28 cycle is where the ovulation is occurring, rupture of that mature Graafian follicle, and the subsequent release of the secondary follicle, or secondary oocyte, into the ovarian, or the uterine tubes. Okay. Why? Because of the hormones estrogens and luteinizing hormone. And the last 2 weeks or so are the post-ovulatory phase, and in the ovaries, the mature follicles collapse to form a corpus luteum under the influence of LH. This corpus luteum is that bursted bubble which will continue to release various hormones, progesterone, estrogens, relaxin, and inhibin. Okay. We call this the luteal phase because it involves that luteum. If an oocyte is not fertilized, that corpus luteum lasts about 2 weeks before it degenerates to become the corpus albicans. As that occurs, levels of progesterone and estrogen inhibin decrease, and therefore GnRH, FSH, and LH will rise due to the loss of negative feedback. And that's going to start the whole process over again. Follicular growth will resume as new ovarian cycle begins. If the oocyte does get fertilized and we form a zygote, it will implant as a blastocyst and begin development, and the chorion of it, we'll talk about the chorion here in just a second, will begin secreting a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin. HCG is its abbreviation, and this is what is tested for in a pregnancy test. Okay? Because a female's only going to produce this if she has something stuck to the lower uterus. Okay? A baby. I had to convince my wife that when we found out we were pregnant the first time, that there was no other way that she could have a positive pregnancy test, but she didn't believe me, so I ended up going to Walmart 3 times that night and buying multiple pregnancy tests. But you gotta do what you gotta do. In the uterus, progesterone and estrogens produced by the luteum promote the growth of the endometrium. Because of the secretory activity of the endometrial glands, we call this the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. Changes peak about 1 week after ovulation when a fertilized ovum might arrive in the uterus. If it doesn't occur, those progesterone and estrogen levels decline due to degeneration of the luteum. And if they are withdrawn, this results in the whole process starting over again. And that process is menstruation. Okay, we've got a fairly complicated couple figures here, but hopefully it will kind of help demonstrate what's occurring in those 4 major phases. Okay, I've actually combined 2 figures. Letter A here actually is a figure that's demonstrating what's happening in the uterus, what we call the uterine cycle, and then up here is the ovarian cycle, what's happening with the follicles and the eggs in the ovaries. Down here is a figure, and I kind of tried to match up the days to demonstrate changes in the hormones that are occurring. So we'll start with the first 4 or 5 days, what we call the menstrual phase, which is where the female's losing that stratum functionalis. Okay, and that's where the bleeding comes from. Okay. Now, due to the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary, the follicles are developing through their stages of development, from the primordial to the primary, from the primary to the secondary, from the secondary to the mature. Okay. You can see FSH levels are fairly high here compared to what they really are throughout the rest. They don't change too much, but they are elevated here, and that's going to influence the release of, or the development of those follicles. Okay. As the secondary follicle and the mature follicle form, they begin secreting estrogens. Okay, and as we see here down at the bottom, estrogen levels go up, and estrogen is going to help with redevelopment of that functionality. So we can see the size of the endometrium is growing. Okay, it's thickening up. Okay. Now, under the influence of LH, about day 14 is where ovulation occurs. Look at LH right there. It peaks at that point, and that's what causes ovulation, the release of the egg, to occur. Okay. Estrogen levels also peak at this time, so estrogens are also involved with ovulation, because estrogens actually influence LH. Okay. Now, that bubble that bursts becomes this structure called a corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum will release several hormones, but progesterone and estrogens are very important. You can see those levels are staying elevated, especially progesterone. They help to keep the growth of that endometrium occurring. Okay. But if fertilization doesn't occur, about 2 weeks later is when the luteum degenerates and becomes this thing called an abacans, which no longer secretes the hormones. And if we withdraw progesterone and estrogen, they dip down. The whole process is going to start over again. And that means menstruation occurs and all that begins again. Pretty amazing, huh? Pretty complicated, though. If you really want to get confused, you can try to walk yourself through this figure. Okay, it's in your textbook. I'm not really going to get into it. Just walk you through kind of the same thing. And it shows how positive feedback, how negative feedback are involved. Like I said, I'm not really going to worry about talking about it because I don't want to confuse you even more. Okay, for the remainder of our lecture, we've got just a couple slides left. We're going to talk about, first, making babies, and then developing babies. To make babies, both man and woman need to be fertile. So we can talk here for a couple slides about fertility. First, let's talk about male fertility. Okay. Probably the major factor related to fertility is the amount of sperm a man produces. Okay. Normal number per milliliter is around 100 million. For a male to be classified as sterile would be less than 20 million per milliliter, which sounds incredible considering that's a ton of numbers, that's a large number, and it only takes one sperm to penetrate an egg, but as you guys know, a lot of those sperm are going to be lost and degenerated through a male's lifetime. Now, the more often a male ejaculates per day, the lower his sperm number will be, which should make sense. Okay, he's just not going to be able to keep up with the production, with his release. Okay, high temperatures, and we talked about this the other day with those two muscles associated with the scrotum that help to kind of keep the testes close to the body when it's cold and farther away from the body when it's hot, because spermatogenesis is best performed about 3 to 5 degrees below core body temperature, about 32 degrees C. If you keep the testes too close to the body or too far away, sperm formation will cease. Just by spending 30 minutes in a hot bath may lead to a 90% decline in sperm number. Tight clothing, they say always tighty whities are going to reduce your fertility. So if you're trying to make babies, you should switch to boxers. Other things or additional factors: excessive consumption of alcohol, major stress, malnutrition. Certain drugs will reduce sperm count, therefore fertility. Radiation decreases male fertility. And I've never really researched why, but sperm production is higher in winter regardless of scrotal temperature. I always kind of joke that it's, just because there's nothing better to do because it's cold outside, might as well stay inside and make babies. Okay, female fertility. Even though men produce the sperm inside of a female will affect her ability to become pregnant. Sperm inside of the female can actually remain motile for a couple days, 4 days, before they start to lose their mobility and then their ability to fertilize. Freshly ovulated eggs are most mature and best for fertilization for about 12 hours after ovulation, but thereafter they gradually age and become less likely to be fertilized. It is not completely impossible, though, for a female to get pregnant, at the beginning or at the end of her reproductive cycle. Females can get pregnant like during menstruation, which is against the belief of many people. Age is very important for females. Fertility is highest anyway in females in their 20s and early 30s. Declines beyond age 30 or late 30s to very low levels in the 40s. And then around age 50 is when a female goes through menopause. Menopause is characterized by cessation of menstrual cycles, ovulation, fertility, and pregnancy. To promote fertility, some females will inject gonadotropins, LH, FSH, or ACG to enhance the number of follicles that they develop in the ovaries, which therefore would also enhance or increase the chance of ovulation. Now, a lot of contraceptives are utilized by females. They actually do the opposite. They aim to reduce fertility or the chance of pregnancy by preventing ovulation, the encounter of sperm and egg, fertilization or implantation. Oral contraceptives like the birth control pill contain synthetic estrogen and progesterone will inhibit the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which means that follicular growth and ovulation won't occur. The birth control pill, or the pill as most people call it, it's actually so effective. You can't ever really say something's 100% effective, but I think it's like in the 99th percentile effective. So you can almost guarantee its effectiveness, but there are still those stories and situations where it can become inactive. And there are things that can affect the effectiveness of the pill, like other drugs and stuff like that. So, all right, so that's fertility, which affects fertilization. We've already defined the word fertilization. Fertilization is the penetration of a secondary oocyte by a sperm cell. Then meiotic division of the secondary oocyte, form an ovum, and then finally the subsequent union of the nuclei of the gametes, which forms the single diploid nucleus in the cell known as a zygote. This typically takes place in the uterine or fallopian tube within 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. Sperm that reach the vicinity of the oocyte within minutes after ejaculation are actually not capable of fertilizing it until about 7 hours later. This is because they have to go through that process of capacitation I talked about the other day. This is a series of functional changes causing the sperm's tail to beat even more vigorously and prepare its plasma membrane to fuse with the oocyte's plasma membrane. Now, for the egg to be penetrated, the sperm must penetrate through 2 layers. A corona radiata, which are granulosa cells that surround the oocyte, and then a deeper zona pellucida, a clear glycoprotein layer, which is between the radiata and the plasma membrane. We talked the other day about the structure of sperm, and covering the head of a sperm is that cap-like vesicle known as acrosome, which contain enzymes that help it to, and I kind of compared it to like a snowplow, burrow in and penetrate the cells of the corona radiata. That allows for the head of the sperm to come into contact with the zona pellucida, and the sperm will then bind to a specific receptor of the sperm receptor ZP3, kind of a cool term, which is found on the zona pellucida. Once bound, the egg plasma membrane will engulf the sperm, and this is considered to be the main stage of fertilization. After that, a zona reaction occurs, which prevents any other sperm from penetrating the egg, because that would be bad news. That's not how you make twins, and that would be creating a non-viable cell. Once a sperm cell enters the secondary oocyte, the oocyte must first complete meiosis II. It forms into those 2 cells, Okay? And at this point, the head of the sperm will become a male pronucleus, and the newly formed cell inside, or the newly formed ovum will become, or the nucleus inside of the ovum will become a female pronucleus. At this point, the nuclei are not fused, and so the chromosomes do not come together. But then they do through the process of pronuclei fusion, and that's what forms our diploid zygotes. Okay. Now, we have two sets of things to talk about at the bottom. Both of them are twins. We have dizygotic, which is the fancy way to describe fraternal twins, or non-identical twins. We call them dizygotic. What does di mean? Two. Why do you think we call it zygotic? Two zygotes, which meant two sperm fertilizing two eggs, which is why fraternal twins are considered to be non-identical. They might look very similar, like Sarah and Laura. Right, you guys are fraternal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But they could also be different gender. And they could look nothing alike. There's a set of twins, I read an article about them, one of those things that popped up I saw somewhere. They're both females. One has dark complected skin. The other one kind of looks like Emily, is kind of fair complected with kind of reddish hair. And one looks more like mom. The other one looks more like dad, because they're mixed children. So it's pretty wild how that can happen. Typically, they're going to look fairly similar, just like siblings will look fairly similar, but they don't always have to be exactly similar. Now, who's going to look exactly similar are monozygotic, or one-zygoted identical twins. And this occurs when that zygote is formed and then splits in half. And so what ends up happening is identical DNA. And so, especially in their younger years, they're going to look so similar that's going to be very easy to confuse them. My dad is an identical twin. I look at his baby pictures, you know, they're all in black and white because my dad's old, but it's tough. I can't tell any way, show how different between the two. Obviously, I can now, but they do look very similar. Why do identical twins a lot of times start to look more different as they get older? It's not genetic. They're still going to have the same genetics. Bingo. How they live their life. Okay. Whether they expose themselves to the sun, if they smoke, if they drink, if they don't take good care of themselves. Okay. They're going to look very different as they get older. It's pretty funny to see like my young nieces and nephews, see my uncle. Because my dad and my uncle look pretty similar. They're both bald, have a goatee and stuff, and they kind of do the double take. The older ones are not susceptible to it, but the younger ones will get confused. I like to call my uncle, he's the evil twin because he went to KU and my dad went to K-State, so there's that sibling rivalry that they have. Okay, after fertilization, about 24 hours later, that zygote begins going through mitosis in a process called cleavage, where one cell becomes two cells, two becomes four, yada, yada, yada. About day 3 is where there are 16 cells. Now, what are these cells going to be, diploid or haploid? Diploid. They're not going to change. The only haploid cells you'll ever see are the gametes, and that's not going to happen for several years. Once the cells have developed into a human, and that human has become an adult. Okay. Successive cleavages eventually leads to a solid sphere of cells called a morula. Okay, a morula is basically just a solid ball of cells, which then the next day will become a blastocyst, which is a sphere that's hollow on the inside. Okay. This is important because this is what will travel to the uterus and stick to the wall in a process called implantation. Okay. The inner cell mass of the blastocyst will become the fetus. The surrounding membrane will become the chorion. That's like I was talking about earlier. That forms that and produces that HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. The chorion is important because it becomes part of the placenta. Placenta itself is a structure through which the exchange of nutrients and waste occurs between the fetal and maternal circulations. It's also known as afterbirth because this is what's pushed out of the female after the baby has come out. The umbilical cord is the actual connection between the placenta and the fetus, and what's left over after the umbilical cord has been cut is a scar known as the umbilicus or navel. What's the best term or most common term for this? Belly button. Good. About 15 days after fertilization, a process called gastrulation occurs. Gastrulation is where we develop the three primary germ layers, endo, meso, and ectoderm. And from these three layers of tissue, our organs develop. Okay. I don't know why they kind of color-coded it like this. It kind of makes it difficult to read. Hopefully you guys can read yours. If you can't, you might have to pull up the lecture online or look in your textbook, because I do want you to know, for example, that the nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm, that the epithelium of the thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, etc. come from the endoderm. So I do want you to know this table. The figure at the top just shows you kind of those same steps that we were talking about. First of all, you can see ovulation, discharge of the secondary oocyte. We see fertilization, forms the zygote, which then undergoes cleavage as it moves towards the uterus. The blastocyst is what will stick or implant on the wall of the uterus and eventually become baby. Okay, the next process is called organogenesis. This is through the weeks 4 through 8, and is very significant part of embryonic development. It's called organogenesis, which literally tells us this is formation of the major organs. This takes place after gastrulation. By the end of the 8th week, all the major body systems have begun to development, although their functions for the most part are very minimal. By the middle of the 4th week, the upper limb buds begin to develop, lower limb buds in the heart prominence form. At the end of the 4th week, the embryo has a tail. During the 5th week, brain and head develop rapidly and the limbs develop further. By the 7th week, regions of the limbs become distinct and digits appear. By the end of the 8th week, eyelids come together, tail disappears, exome genitalia begins to differentiate, digits are distinct and no longer wet. So when a female is pregnant, this is like between the end of the 1st month and the 2nd month. So it's still 1st trimester. 1st trimester is very, very important. Okay. Now, the last 2 trimesters really represent the fetal period, or not quite the last 2 trimesters. Still includes part of the 1st trimester. The fetal period is 9th week through birth, and during this time, tissues and organs that develop during embryonic period grow and differentiate. Very few new structures appear, but the rate of body growth is remarkable, especially in the last half of the intrauterine life. So really in the last part of 2nd trimester and 3rd trimester. And you can go back to that very first picture on the first page to really see that as the baby really grows in size towards the 40th week. A lot of people are not familiar or not aware of this, but when a female has 9 months of pregnancy, it's not when 9 months starts at the end of 8th month, she still has to go another 4 weeks typically. So that's sometimes not thought of when people get pregnant. They're like, oh crap. In the 4th week, those last 4 weeks are generally when mama bear is the least comfortable. I don't care about the table. I do think it's kind of cool. You can kind of read through it and see what's actually occurring, so that's kind of important, but I won't ask you anything directly from the test. Okay, any questions?